Good evening. I'm Steven Cowie, and it's an honor to present to Civil War Roundtable Congress. I'm here to talk about my new book, which investigates the Battle of Antietam and its impact on the Sharpsburg community. It's a passion project of mine. It's taken approximately 15 years to research and an additional 3 years to write. And it's based on an abundance of primary sources, including congressional cases and war claims that I located at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. These claims papers contained a trove of new information about Antietam's impact on the community, and they related to approximately 150 families that lived on and off the battlefield in September 1862. The structure of my presentation tonight is similar to that of the book. I'm going to take you all through the battle's prelude. We'll also touch on the bloody fighting on September 17th and the gory aftermath. And we'll also examine the Army of the Potomac's 6-week encampment after the battle, during which time federal soldiers took a devastating amount of property from the community of Sharpsburg and spread deadly diseases as well. And last, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the frustrating and decades-long claims process in which civilians pursued compensation from the United States government for their Antietam-related losses and damages. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the content. For those of you who are not familiar with Sharpsburg, it's located roughly 45 miles southwest of Gettysburg, and it is in western Maryland near the Potomac River, which you see here on the left side of your screen, and Antietam Creek, which ran east of Sharpsburg. In the year 1860, the federal census shows there were about 2,400 residents that lived in Sharpsburg district. It was a sparsely populated farming community that included around 200 free persons of color and 150 slaves. In September of 1862, in the early part to the middle part of the month, most of the people in this area who worked in farming were focusing their efforts on threshing wheat, which was a very important cash crop to this community. They were also in smaller increments threshing rye and oats, and they were moving giant stacks of cured hay, which had been sitting out all summer, Timothy hay and first growth clover hay. They were moving all that feed into their barns and preparing to harvest acres and acres of nearly ripe corn and apples and potatoes. All of these agricultural products were crucial to one's annual income, and they also provided food for families and livestock. So when we see it this way, mid-September 1862 was probably the worst time for an interruption of farming. But then came Antietam. And it's not in the scope of my research, nor do we have time in this presentation for me to give you a detailed overview of the Maryland campaign of 1862. Instead, we're going to fast forward to September 15th, 1862, when the armies arrived in the Antietam Valley. And for 2 days, on September 15th and 16th, General George McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac for the United States, made preparations to attack General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. During these 2 days, all was not quiet because the cannonading between these two armies was especially violent on September 16th after the fog lifted. And the sharp skirmishing that broke out later that afternoon north of Sharpsburg, this combined musketry and artillery fire scared the daylights out of these local folks because up until that time, Sharpsburg had not hosted Civil War combat. And as a result, dozens of families fled their homes and sought shelter in distant places along the Potomac River, such as canal lock houses and caves and riverside adjoining farmsteads. There were a number of residents in the town of Sharpsburg who did not leave their homes. Instead, they went down into the basements of stone and brick dwellings to take their chances on weathering the storm of artillery fire. And they knew that it was hitting the town because on September 16th, a number of these projectiles struck buildings in the town of Sharpsburg. So they knew it was coming. But in any regards, these cellars and basements in the town became quite cramped. And we know this because there was one deposition of a townsman who testified in a claims case that from September 15th through the 18th, he was sheltering in his cellar with 75 other residents who lived in the village. Now, the Battle of Antietam erupted in the pre-dawn hours of September 17th. I'm not here to give you a tactical overview of what happened from a military perspective during the battle. Instead, I'm going to emphasize that this tornado of destruction unfolded on ground where people lived. It's where they worked, where they worshiped. It was their home. And these three phases of combat during the Battle of Antietam just wrecked properties, various types of farm fields and crop fields, pasture. It just devastated ground all throughout this sector of combat. And the fighting was so bad that we know it to this day as the deadliest day in American military history. The estimated casualties were roughly 23,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. And one of the residents who returned home after the battle witnessed this carnage. She was only a teenager at the time, and her name was Mary Ellen Piper. For those of you who are familiar with Antietam, she was the daughter of Henry and Elizabeth Piper, who lived in the middle of the battlefield. And she came across horrendous sights on her way home, bodies and body parts and dead horses. And she wrote to an acquaintance about 3 weeks after the battle, "You could have walked 5 miles and not been off the battlefield. No tongue can tell, nor pen describe the horrors." Much of this carnage was caused by artillery, and it's estimated there were about 520 artillery pieces engaged on September 17th. And this destructive fire killed countless soldiers and damaged a number of buildings as well. What we see here on the left of the slide is the Dunker Church. There was one soldier who described a cannonball hole in one of the walls so large that a man could walk through. There were grist mills that were battered on the battlefield, owned by Joshua Newcomer and also Colonel John Miller. And when I reviewed the war claims for these battlefield farmsteads, all but one farmer, John Otto, mentioned artillery damages or musket balls striking the property in their claims for damages. This was especially costly to farmers like David R. Miller, Colonel John Miller, and of course, we know for those who study Antietam, the Mumma family suffered perhaps the worst. Confederates intentionally set fire to the Mumma's farmhouse to prevent federal marksmen from occupying the building. Artillery fire also destroyed the Mumma's barn and outbuildings. Now, speaking of barns, what we see on the right of this slide, that's a great example of one of the buildings that was struck outside the boundaries of the modern battlefield. Because as park rangers explain in their talks to this day, there may have been about 50,000 rounds of artillery fired on September 17th. And we know from the war claims that hundreds of these missiles went either east of Antietam Creek or west of the Confederate line. This barn is located right across from where the Antietam Battlefield's Visitor Center now stands. It was owned in September 1862 by Samuel and Sarusha Reel, adjoining Samuel's farm to the south. For those of you who have been to Sharpsburg, there's another farm owned by the Reels right across from Battleview Market. That was owned by David Reel. Well, both Samuel Reel's barn and David Reel's barn were both destroyed by fire during the battle. And coincidentally, not only did this destruction just obliterate all grains that were inside the barns and farming equipment and tools, but there were also Confederate soldiers reportedly sheltering in both of these structures. at the time they caught fire, and medical personnel could not evacuate these soldiers in time. In fact, some young boys who were rummaging through the ashes after the battle, according to local lore, they were searching for souvenirs. Instead, what they found were human bones. In addition, this is another example of how a lot of these artillery shells missed their marks and sailed into properties beyond the boundaries of fighting. We're looking at the town of Sharpsburg in these images, and just east of the camera position is where Confederate batteries were posted during the battle. And the Federal Reserve Artillery posted east of Antietam Creek, they were targeting these Confederate batteries, and hundreds of shells sailed into the town in the path where you're now looking in these slides. And this is based on soldier accounts from the 5th Corps when they entered Sharpsburg on September 19th, as well as newspaper correspondence and several dozen claims for damages of people who lived in the town of Sharpsburg. Dozens of buildings caught fire, stores were struck, churches were hit, as you see with the Lutheran church on the left side of the screen. There were 2 barns that were destroyed in the center of town near the public square. And also among the houses that were destroyed by fire in the town were 2 frame dwellings owned by widows Margaret Shackelford and Sarah Himes. A review of the land records that I researched and the census patterns indicate that these were the only properties that these 2 widows owned in September 1862, and the destruction of those homes rendered the ladies and their children homeless. As the sun set on September 17th and the Battle of Antietam concluded, structure fires, according to several accounts, they dyed the night sky an eerie shade of red. And there was a newspaper correspondent who was present at the time, and he observed, "Near the town, haystacks, barns, and houses are in flames. All the country is flaming, smoking, burning, as if the last great day, the judgment day of the Lord, had come." What we see here in this slide, this is an example of what some of these people experienced when they were in their shelters during the battle. I jumped ahead. I should have mentioned this slide about 2 minutes earlier. I'm showing my true rookie my true rookie colors right now. But this is known as the Kretzer of John and the cellar of John and Susan Kretzer. And their daughter, Teresa, later gave an account of sheltering in this cellar during the battle. And her account was, she described that every time the firing began extra hard, the babies would cry and the dogs would bark. Occasionally, a woman would become quite unnerved and hysterical, and some of those old-aged men would break out in prayer. All right, so another way that Antietam impacted the community was field hospitals. There were approximately 17,000 men wounded during the battle, and several thousand of those Confederates left with Lee's army when he withdrew to Virginia on the evening of September 18th. But there may have been, a conservative estimate may have been 12,000 wounded who remained in the Sharpsburg environs just in the immediate aftermath of Antietam. And because of this overwhelming amount of wounded in this sparsely populated community, there weren't enough structures to house all these patients. And so the medical departments of both armies had no choice but to commandeer every property in the area for hospital purposes. And when these families, when they emerged from their cramped cellars or their distant evacuation sites and returned to their own homes, they found them overflowing with wounded and medical personnel in the homes performing grisly operations and amputations. And what I found in the research is that there were a number of families that were turned away from their dwellings upon arriving home because there was no room for them. So they had to find temporary shelter elsewhere. And these accounts varied. Some families were able to return and reoccupy their dwelling within a few days. For others, it was up to 6, 7, 8 weeks. And there were 2 families that were displaced for 2 or 3 months. Some families were allowed 1 or 2 rooms in these dwellings to share them with the patients. Nonetheless, these inconveniences paled in comparison to what the true emergency was at that time, and that was a severe medical supply crisis. And we know this because of the reports, the 1862 reports of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and also the after-action report of Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. What we find in looking at these accounts is that supplies didn't start trickling into these hospitals at Sharpsburg and Keedysville until about September 21st, several days after the battle. And even then, the U.S. Sanitary Commission bemoaned the insufficiency of these supplies. They were not adequate enough to treat all the patients who needed urgent care. So in response, the medical departments had no choice but to enter the homes of the civilians and take what supplies they could to for hospital needs. And this included clothing. When I went through the claims, and I pulled 250 claims from the National Archives, so I had a nice array of evidence from which to choose. There were dozens of these petitions that listed the loss of their entire clothing, not just for the husbands and wives of the households, but for all of their children. Not a stitch of clothing left, according to the allegations. In addition, the hospital personnel took bedding from these houses, anything that could be torn into bandages, sheets, blankets, quilts, coverlids, pillowcases. In some of these homes, the soldiers carried off carpeting, window blinds, tablecloths. It spotlights the urgency of the lack of supplies after the battle. And to cook food and serve food to the wounded, the medical department's wagons for the Army of the Potomac were stranded in Frederick. They'd put them safely in the rear of the Federal lines before the battle, but when they needed them most, they weren't able to get these wagons up quickly enough, and there were boxcars of medical supplies that were stranded between Washington and Frederick, and Baltimore and Frederick. I'm going to get into those delays shortly as to why those boxcars of supplies couldn't be rushed up. But regardless, we see the kitchenware disappear in the civilians' homes as well. Pots and pans and buckets and basins and dishes, silverware, you name it. Kitchens were gutted of all types of cookware, eatingware, and so forth. One would think that the citizens who lived in this area would have been irate, extremely upset to come home and just find things upside down. Their worlds had completely turned into a nightmare rapidly because of the battle and its aftermath. But they also saw firsthand thousands of men who were in need of immediate care. And the evidence overwhelmingly shows that these people who lived in the area near the battlefield pitched into the crisis to help. Whatever food they had left, they were baking bread, making soup. Some farmers willingly slaughtered their own livestock. Other men in the community, there was one fascinating deposition, but several of them were waking up at 4 a.m. and taking their wagons and their four-horse teams all the way to Hagerstown, 12 miles north, paying the tolls on the Hagerstown Pike out of their own pocket to search for supplies for the desperate army surgeons at Sharpsburg and Keedysville, working on the front lines, whether they had wounded in their own homes or whether they were making rounds to the hospitals and volunteering. These civilians saw gruesome and graphic operations, soldiers with wounds of all types that I describe in grisly detail in the book. But for this talk, I'll leave it with just one quote by a hospital volunteer who wrote, "The name of Antietam is ever associated in my mind with scenes of horror." It's important to note that hospital staff were not the only ones entering people's homes during and after the battle. The claims tell us in a number of different cases, heartbreakingly so, that numerous citizens lost valuable personal items and sentimental possessions due to these break-ins by the stragglers. Cash and jewelry, family photographs, Bibles, children's toys. There were some accounts of safes being destroyed and homes being vandalized. One townsman who lived in Sharpsburg, he described in a letter that was written just 2 weeks after the battle, some of the Confederate-related thefts. He wrote, "They entered several poor people's houses and robbed them of everything they had in the world. 2/3 of the families in this place had nothing but the clothes on their back." But war claims allege that Union soldiers also plundered a number of properties. And in fact, General McClellan, on October 1st, 1862, issued General Order Number 159 to address the stragglers and pillagers of the Army of the Potomac, lawlessly depredating upon the civilians. The heavy losses from the stragglers and the medical departments, they cast many residents into troubled circumstances. I'll give you an example of the wife of a tenant farmer who testified after the Antietam battle. The Union troops came on the farm and took everything we had and ruined us. I know we lost all we had. Now, McClellan's special order brought many of the Union soldiers back into line, but the Army of the Potomac continued taking property, copious amounts of property from the community, and here's why. When we look at campaigns like Gettysburg and Monocacy in 1863 and 1864, the armies fought, and shortly after, the armies left, leaving their wounded and their medical personnel behind. After Lee's army, after the Battle of Antietam, left Maryland on the evening of September 18th, the Army of the Potomac remained in the Sharpsburg area for 6 weeks. McClellan stretched his army along the Potomac River, going all the way north of Sharpsburg from Williamsport, all the way along the river south of Sharpsburg to Harper's Ferry. Now, what we see in this map, that's most of the Army of the Potomac, and where they encamped? Near Sharpsburg. And according to the OR, the official records, on October 1st, 1862, just in this little 5-mile, I say little, just in this 5-mile radius of Sharpsburg that we see on this map for these 4 Army Corps, there were approximately 75,000 men and officers present for duty on October 1st. This number includes a number of reinforcements who arrived from Washington after the battle. Those 75,000 people in this area, one environmental study noted that population of human beings just in the Sharpsburg area at that time outnumbered cities like Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and Detroit and Washington, D.C. But those large cities had systems and networks in place to supply their large populations. What we see here on this map, Sharpsburg, it was a rural farming community that in September 1862 did not even have a railroad depot. And worse, south of Sharpsburg, earlier in the Maryland campaign, Confederates sabotaged some of the Army of the Potomac supply lines, the AOP's supply lines. They burned the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge at Monocacy Junction. They tapped the C&O Canal in several places, and they destroyed 2 bridges at Harper's Ferry. This severely delayed supplies from reaching McClellan's army, and until the War Department could circuitously route the supplies and establish depots in Hagerstown and Frederick, what happened was, according to the civilians, was that the Army of the Potomac officially depended on Sharpsburg as their unofficial supply depot until these depots could be established. And supplies did begin trickling into the area later, but until then, they were severely limited in their supplies, and it didn't just affect the medical department. The commissary department and also the quartermaster department of McClellan's army also were in need of supplies. And I'm going to jump in and give you an example of some of the commissary needs. When we look at the food shortage for the army, foraging parties, whether authorized or unauthorized, army butchers, hospital cooks, all of these forces descended upon the properties of that 5-mile radius that I just showed you on that map and stripped countless homes of all of their food, every morsel they could take. The war claims, the witness testimonies, they all strongly support this. In fact, a Hagerstown newspaper reported in early October 1862, "What our people will do to obtain food for man and beast during the approaching winter, God alone only knows." Based on the accounts, soldiers ravaged gardens and potato patches and apple orchards. They went into smokehouses and carried off all types of cured meat like ham and shoulders and bacon. They went into the cellars of homes and carried off barrels of pickles and flour, preserves, salt, sugar, you name it. If they could use it and eat it, they took it. And I'm going to jump into livestock here. There's a reason I threw this up on the screen. And just a conservative sample of war claims that I reviewed from September 15th, 1862 through the end of October. During that 6-week encampment, the Army of the Potomac allegedly took from these claimants in my sample 1,600 head of livestock. That was cattle, sheep, and swine, along with roughly 3,000 chickens. The quote on the left side of the screen, there were a couple citizens that just found it peculiar that these sounds that they had heard for all their lives living in this farming community were suddenly everything had gone silent without roosters, crowing and the sounds of other livestock. Everything became just eerily quiet with all these animals being butchered. The soldiers, it's important to note that all of these items that were taken, according to the allegations, soldiers offered no payment and they asked no permission. To give you one example, Joseph Poffenberger, he was one of the farmers that lived on the Antietam battlefield. His farmhouse was on the northern part of the field near the North Woods. He testified in his claims case that officers came onto his farm just after the battle, and they explained to him that their wagon supplies had not come up, they were out of rations, and they must have food for themselves. They rounded up every single one of Poffenberger's livestock and proceeded to butcher the animals. A farmhand who was with Poffenberger at the time, he later testified in the claims case. I was with Mr. Poffenberger at the time they were taken. He was so distressed that he could not eat. But humans were not the only ones who were in need of food after the battle, because when we look at the OR, there were approximately 16,000 horses and mules attached to the Army of the Potomac during this 6-week encampment just in the Sharpsburg vicinity. And all of these Army animals needed copious amounts of daily forage to survive. Again, I went into the war claims, and one by one, I tallied up the totals, and this is a conservative estimate. But from September 15th through the end of October 1862, the animals of McClellan's army reportedly consumed and destroyed more than 4,000 tons of wheat, hay, rye, oats, corn, and corn fodder. This was essentially Sharpsburg's fall harvest, and it was gone. It just vanished rapidly. These army animals, they could eat a lot of food, and they could eat it very quickly. To give you one example, a resident who lived just south of the town of Sharpsburg, he testified in his congressional case that just after the battle, these animals were set loose onto his farms, and all the products on his properties disappeared like frost before a burning sun. Now, the losses I've described are just the tip of the iceberg. Soldiers also took dozens of horses and mules from citizens who lived in Sharpsburg and Keedysville without offering permission or payment. They stripped farms and roadways of all types of fencing to use the rails in their camps and hospitals for cooking fuel and warmth. This evisceration of fencing throughout the area was so widespread, soldiers were even pulling and yanking out locust posts from the ground to use as firewood. But certain sections of Sharpsburg were so wiped out of fencing that witnesses described it as a barren plain. There were miles of fence on some of these farmsteads, and every rail was gone, according to the claimants and a number of their witnesses in their sworn depositions. In addition, I found this astonishing in my research, but when all the fencing disappeared, soldiers proceeded to tear down several tenant homes, outbuildings, stables, sheds to use that wood as firewood. They even ripped apart the interiors of several canal boats. Now, some of this wood they used as flooring in their tents, but a lot of it went into their fires in the camps and hospitals as well. They tore out the floors of churches, broke apart pews. Anything that was wood was pretty much used by the Army during this 6-week occupation, and that included mature hardwood trees. I was shocked the allegations by farmers describing the thousands of trees that the Army of the Potomac cut down after the Battle of Antietam, not only to split apart the logs to use as firewood, but they used these trees to build log shelters in their camps as the evening temperatures became quite cold throughout October. We know this wasn't just elaborate, just sweeping allegations by the claimants. These losses were certified by professional appraisers, civilian appraisers, surveyors rather, and also quartermaster agents who walked through the ravaged woodlots and counted the stumps. It wasn't uncommon for some of these farms to lose anywhere from 30 to 40 acres of mature hardwoods during this time. All of these losses I've described threw many families into financially catastrophic circumstances. For example, without horses, how were farmers supposed to haul their grains, what was left of them, to the market to sell? And without fencing, how could farmers resume growing crops in 1863 to protect those products from foraging wildlife? Fencing was extremely expensive and laborious to replace. But in many regards, all these monetary losses were the least of their problems because a deadly disease epidemic raged across this region after the battle. The ecological and environmental conditions after the Battle of Antietam were abysmal. There were dozens of Army horses that lay on the field and rotted throughout late October. Soldiers tried to burn some of them to no avail. These horses were rotting on the battlefield when President Abraham Lincoln toured it in 1862. And I think it was the first week of October 1862 when he toured the Antietam battlefield. There were shallow graves of thousands of soldiers with some of the limbs protruding through the dirt. So the decomposition was the stench was just emanating through this shallow amount of dirt that was thrown over the remains of these soldiers. We have to factor in the piles of amputated limbs that were outside the field hospitals, attracting swarms of flies, the latrine sinks of 75,000 soldiers. It was just terrible, the stench that soldiers and civilians alike described. The bigger problem is that Sharpsburg's groundwater was shallowly located just underneath all of these surface contaminants, and things like the Army animals, McClellan's Army animals. When we look at the duration of six weeks staying in this area, and we bring in the Confederate animals that were there from September 15th through the 18th, there may have been 4,000 tons of manure deposited on this ground, which contains E. coli and a host of other pathogens. All this decaying matter on the surface, it didn't take much for a rainfall to wash all that into the groundwater. And with the swarms of houseflies going, from the latrine sinks and the manure to places where people were eating, it's no surprise that the disease outbreak erupted. And what it brought to this community was typhoid fever, diarrhea, and dysentery. And this is based on a lot of hospital research that other authors have conducted, along with some research I conducted I accessed the original medical day books of this man right here. His name is Dr. Augustine A. Biggs, and he was Sharpsburg's doctor before, during, and after the war. These day books were containing extremely, it was just a wonderful amount of information that I had because he kept these all throughout his career. So I was able to look at his before and after numbers and compare that to what he was dealing with after the battle. In each page of his day book, he logged the date, the names of his patients, where he was administering these house calls, and all the medicines that he dispensed. A look into all the medicines. I don't proclaim to be a medical historian by any means, but when you do the research, you find out that a lot of these medicines were used to treat typhoid fever, diarrhea, and dysentery, the same diseases that were reported in the Army camps and hospitals at Antietam. I took these numbers that I crunched in Biggs's daybook and compared it to burial and death records for Sharpsburg from 1850 to 1870. And what I see in both the daybooks and the death records is a chilling spike that began late September 1862 and lasted until about mid-December 1862. These numbers remained high until about May the following year, but what we see is, you know, a lot of these patients, Biggs's house calls quadrupled during this time. It was terrible. And the number of burials in some of these local graveyards quadrupled as well. It's impossible to gauge the number of civilians who died during this outbreak. But one local man, he put this into perspective when he was describing the typhoid fever cases of his granddaughters and the disease-related death of his brother, all these who died during this outbreak. His name was Jacob Miller. He lived in the town of Sharpsburg. And in late 1862, he wrote, "Many other citizens and hundreds of soldiers have been taken with the same, and many died. It is an army disease, thus adds an addition to the horrors of war." And that brings us to the final part of my research, the congressional cases and the war claims. This process consisted of 3 phases: the Act of July 4, 1864, the Bowman Act of 1883, and the Tucker Act of 1887. All 3 of these acts were divided into 2 parts: merits, which investigated the facts of a case, and loyalty, which investigated a claimant's political leanings during the war. For Sharpsburg petitioners, the process began with the Act of July 4, 1864, also known as the July 4th Act. And it empowered Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs to dispatch special agents from his quartermaster department to the Sharpsburg area to tour the affected properties and investigate the petitions and the claims and interview petitioners and their witnesses. There were a number of problems presented to claimants with this July 4th Act. For example, there were countless families were teetering on economic ruin after the Antietam campaign. They had lost so much property and they had received no payment whatsoever in exchange. By the time it came for these claims cases to begin in earnest in the Sharpsburg-Keedysville area, that didn't take place until the mid-1870s. And by that time, Congress had inserted a number of clauses into the act which further limited what petitioners could claim. For example, anything related to theft and depredations was barred. Anything related to the medical department or hospital occupation, hospital rent was barred. Churches who hosted field hospitals for a number of weeks, even months, churches were not allowed to apply. They could not petition the government for claims reimbursement through this July 4th Act. And I'll give you one example of a local family, Samuel and Elizabeth Mumma. They lived in the middle of the Antietam battlefield, and their farm was destroyed. Confederates set fire to the house. Artillery fire destroyed the outbuildings. We don't know which army was responsible for that artillery fire. But the Act of July 4 did not allow damages related to combat. They chalked it up to the ordinary ravages of war. So it wouldn't have mattered if federal soldiers would have set fire to the Mumma's farmhouse. It happened during the battle, and the family could not claim a penny for this devastation to their home, to their farmstead. Other drawbacks with the July 4th Act included the astonishing amount of paperwork that civilians were expected to provide. They had to identify the names of federal officers responsible for appropriating supplies, and when possible, give the War Department the postal addresses for those federal officers. Civilians were also asked to furnish certified vouchers and receipts, which quartermaster officers, interestingly, did not furnish to civilians at Antietam, at least not in the manner that they were directed by McClellan's circular issued earlier in the Maryland campaign. Throughout these claims that I reviewed, there's just this phrase you see throughout. It's "no receipt received therefore." Well, the nice part of having access to these claims is you can read the searches, the reports made by the third auditor of the Treasury, and the third auditor of the Treasury directed his clerks to search the accounts and returns for the quartermaster officers in the Army of the Potomac for September and October 1862, and for the 127 July 4th claims that I reviewed, they only found 1 receipt. So without the paperwork to provide the War Department for their claims cases, these people weren't going to get paid. And slowly but surely, their petitions were whittled down to almost nothing. Not surprisingly, when we look at the outcome of the July 4th Act, Quartermaster Meigs, he rejected more than half the cases, and of those petitioners who did receive settlements, those payments constituted on average about 15% of the total amount claimed. People are outraged, understandably, and it didn't just relate to Sharpsburg. There were claimants in northern and border states who were outraged at the rules of the July 4th Act, and the outpouring of complaints forced state representatives to take action. And in response, Congress passed the Bowman Act in 1883 and the Tucker Act in 1887. Now, these acts were remedial in nature. The outcomes were more favorable to the claimants subsequently. There was a lot of pushback. The depositions were very fascinating to read because these latter acts actually shifted the jurisdiction of the claims to the U.S. Court of Claims and directed the U.S. Department of Justice and the United States Attorney General to send assistant attorneys to the Sharpsburg area to interrogate claimants and their witnesses. So there were some good fights going on here legally between the claimants and their and these attorneys. What we see on the right of this slide, a lot of these citizens provided professional surveys of their farms, of their fence lines, their hay mows, their woodlots, trying to provide whatever evidence for which they paid out of their own pocket to certify whatever evidence they could to prove their losses to the U.S. government. Ultimately, what I found is that in a review of 65 of these congressional jurisdiction cases, the U.S. Court of Claims, they recommended settlements to about one half the petitioners, and of those folks who received Treasury settlements, those payments constituted about one half of what they were seeking. So on the positive side, a lot of these people were able to finally have closure from the Battle of Antietam. However, half of those people received nothing for a variety of reasons: suspected disloyalty, insufficient evidence. But what was extremely disadvantageous to these people is that these cases dragged from the 1880s and 1990s into the 1900s. And by then, a lot of the claimants had died, and the cases hinged on the memories of any surviving witnesses and former employees and people like that. And in fact, the final cases that I reviewed for this study were settled in the year 1915, 53 years after the battle. I'll close this presentation with a quote by a witness in one of those late cases. Her name was Angeline Jackson. And in September 1862, she was a 17-year-old domestic servant working and living on the farm of Captain David Smith, who lived just west of the town of Sharpsburg. And almost 40 years later, in the year 1900, Angeline Jackson, she testified in Captain Smith's Tucker Act case. Smith had long since died, so they were just trying to recruit whatever witnesses they could find. And what I found in a lot of these late cases is that these assistant attorneys were able to go after people and attack their memory of what had happened, 40 or so years earlier at Antietam, asking them to recall and recount the number of bushels of wheat that were taken and the number of head of cattle that were slaughtered and so forth. Well, they hit a wall when they were trying to test the memory of Angeline Jackson, because she provided a lengthy deposition providing explicit details of all these losses, describing how federal soldiers after the Battle of Antietam stripped Captain Smith's farm bare of all of its resources. And while giving this deposition, Angeline went off script as the attorneys continued to cross-examine her and question her memory. And she stated something, not only to kind of put them in their place, but she stated something that I think represents the memory of many other civilians who experienced the horrendous effects of the Battle of Antietam. Angeline stated, "I remember all these things distinctly. It seems to have been burned into my mind, and I shall remember it as long as I can remember anything." And that concludes my presentation. I thank you all very much for watching. Before I jump to questions and comments, I thought I'd make the publisher happy, make Ted Savis happy, by mentioning where you all can buy the book. It's available for purchase at Savis Beatty and Amazon. I encourage anyone interested in getting this book to choose the former, because Savas Beatty will include a signed book plate with your order. And I also like just to encourage people to support independent publishing. So with that in mind, I would like to thank you all once again sincerely for your time and attention. It's been an honor to present to you all tonight. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take any questions or comments.